Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to begin in just a couple minutes. We just ask for everybody to wait a little bit before we get started, okay? Just making sure everybody gets to connect on time. So, 2 minutes will begin. Thank you.
Hi. What time is it?
Yeah, we'll begin in 1 minute, okay?
Okay.
Can you mute your phone, Bonnie?
Pardon me?
Can you mute
I'm
your
on my
phone?
phone.
Yeah, can you
Yeah.
mute it? Mute it, please.
Okay, star
Okay.
6.
Thank you, dear. Welcome, everybody. So it's 6:30. We're going to begin our study session. Hopefully, everything will run smoothly today. We had some issues that I think we're getting them worked out. Today's theme and study is going to be God-centered lives and our duality. Okay, so it runs along with the theme that we've done the past couple weeks, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into Meishu Sama's uh, way of seeing a God centered life and um, how we can manage to do that ourselves. So, as in with all study sessions, I ask us to, in the name of Messiah, which is one with Meishu Sama, surrender all our feelings and thoughts that we have during today's study session back to God as we're being nurtured to be born anew as God's children, Messiahs. So I'd like to start the study session with the sacred oath. Please follow along. Sacred oath. With great fear of God, we acknowledge that the Lord God is our true Father, the one and only God. We revere Meishu Sama as the model for all humanity and as our own example to follow. Meishu Sama, who was born anew as a true child of God, Messiah, by receiving the divine will of God accomplished in heaven. We believe that Jesus Christ, who 2,000 years ago embodied the name of Messiah, the name most holy and high, is serving the Lord God in unity with Meishu Sama. And we regard the messages of Kyosho Sama, who reveals to us the will of Meishu Sama in this material world, as the sole, absolute, and irreplaceable foundation in advancing our mission here on earth. Now I'd like to do the words of prayer. God, I acknowledge that you are alive. Within me, you are alive. I thank you for nurturing me to be newly born as your child. May this blessing be shared with all. In the name of Messiah, which is one with Meishu Sama, I surrender myself to you. Please use me as you wish. Thank you. I hope the stream is okay. Everybody's being able to follow okay. We're not having any issues. If we do, please text in and let us know if there's any video issues. So, what do we know about Meishu Sama? Is the first question in theme today. And there are a few things that we can say off the top of our heads. Meishu Sama surrendered his life to serve God. So everything he did, he dedicated his entire life to serving God. We also know that he accomplished the will of God and was born anew as a Messiah. We also know that and believe that he is serving the Lord God with Christ. And he's the model for us to follow. So today I'd like to go a little bit deeper into this model of Meishu Sama for us to follow. What was Meishu Sama's state of mind is what I like to see and question today when he declared that Jorei is not as important now. When he also stated that from here on we enter the world of Sonin. And then when he said it is different from before, from here on Sonin is particularly important. So I think these are very crucial statements that Meishu Sama made. It's not for nothing that we are emphasizing it so much worldwide, according to these revelations that we've been receiving. So, what was Meishu Sama's state of mind during those expressions? Why would Meishu Sama turn the church upside down? And the reason why I ask that is because literally, as Meishu Sama made those statements 1 year before his transition, they turned our church upside down. Up to that point in church history, we were expanding God's work and doing God's work through Jorei, through the physical act of Jorei that we know. And that was the main focus of our activities. But when Meishu Sama said, this is secondary now, that Sonin was more important, literally, he must have turned heads, turned the church upside down. But why would he do that? And today I'd like to share a teaching with you that I found, teaching that we've also read in our services. But going through, I think it would be very important for us to understand Meishu Sama's thought and mind process during that time. This sermon was done on April 15, 1952. Meishu Sama says, as humans judge others by their appearances, they do not understand the truth in them. Humans make decisions through observing outward appearances, and this is dangerous. God, on the other hand, sees through what hides beneath as well as into the soul. God knows everything, and we cannot hide from his eyes. Since humans are fixated on appearances, they are concerned about how things look. They are worried about how others view their actions. And this, I say, is a pitfall. That is why I always tell you, do not care about how others see you, but care about how God sees you. Then Meishu Sama continues, there is no need for you to please humans. You must please God only. Even though I've been telling you this for some time, it is unfortunate that there are some who still try to please humans. While it is true that people in general place importance on pleasing others, and this is accepted as a social norm, in our case, in the case of God, it does not work this way. I hear that in other religions, when people make a generous donation, they display the names along with the amount of money that they donated. I do not do things like that. I have no idea who donated and how much they donated. In our religion, you cannot receive any honor by showing off how much you donated. I only care about how God sees me. Humans are not my objective. To be seen by God, this is my objective, and this, I believe, is the true way. That is why my thinking is God-centered. I only care about how God sees me. I only care about how to please God. This is how you should live too. So in this teaching, Meishu Sama stresses many times how he cares about pleasing God. I like to emphasize a few points. He says in the beginning of the teaching, humans make decisions through observing outward appearances, and this is dangerous. Since humans are fixated on appearances, they are concerned about how things look. They are worried about how others view their actions. And this, I say, is a pitfall. So Misham is stressing that we fail because we are so worried about how our actions are going to be perceived by people. Do not care. That is why I always tell you, do not care about how others see you, but care about how God sees you. Maybe someone maybe stresses over 6 times in this teaching the importance of how God sees us and that we should care about pleasing God. Then he continues here in these other phrases I'd like to stress. There is no need for you to please humans. You must please God only. While it is true that people in general place importance on pleasing others, and this is accepted as a social norm, in our case, in the case of God, it does not work this way. Then, the last point I like to stress. I only care about how God sees me. Humans are not my objective. To be seen by God, this is my objective. And this, I believe, is the true way. That is why my thinking is God-centered. I only care about how God sees me. I only care about how to please God. This is how you should live too. So Mish Sama was giving us a warning, in a way, of how we should be living our lives. Now take it, this teaching was written in 1952. This was 2 years after Meishu Sama changed the name of the church to World Church of Messiah. Imagine how much contradiction or how much opposing feelings Meishu Sama must have received when he declared the name of the church as World Church of Messiah. Basically using a Christian name, Messiah at that, which is very powerful, in a very Japanese Oriental church. And Meishu Sama stressed in this very small teaching so many times the importance of pleasing God. Everything that he was doing was to please God. But what was Meishu Sama's ultimate goal? Yes, it was to please God. But in the teaching where he says the birth of our religion, he says, I'm just doing a few parts of this teaching because it's very long. He talks about a new culture being built. And then he says, what is this new culture that is supposed to be taking over the old one? Let me just say that it is absolutely impossible to get even the smallest glimpse of it through human intelligence. But what exactly is it? Who on earth is entrusted with the task of creating this new culture? When we consider these questions, we at long last, and regardless of whether we believe in it or not, have to acknowledge the existence of an entity known to us as God. So Meishu Sama talks about a new culture, a new world being built. And for that, we need to acknowledge the existence of God, whether we believe it or not. And then he says, skipping a couple parts, and so the basic requirement we are proposing in order to be a part of creating an earthly paradise, this new culture, the motto of our religion, is for each individual to be elevated and attain the right to become a resident of heaven. If these kinds of individuals increase, a paradise on earth must appear someday, as the world is made up of individuals. So Meishu Sama's main goal was not to create a paradise on earth for humans, it was to please God. And with that purpose, it was to teach us that we needed to learn to believe in God and elevate ourselves to become residents of that heaven, to learn to become residents of that heaven. And as that happens in an individual level, one by one, the world in general will someday become a paradise because it's made of individuals. So Mishama's ultimate goal to please God was to every individual become a resident of heaven. And what's interesting is this teaching is that it shows exactly how Meishu Sama was received when he stated this truth to the world, how he was really accepted. Here he says in the same teaching, what should be noted here is that when a theory slightly ahead of its time is proposed, it receives praise and admiration from intellectuals. This is because a theory of that grade is most easily accepted by those who have gone through the education of the established culture. However, if for some reason a theory that is completely advanced and far off from the standard of its time is put forward, it is utterly impossible for people to comprehend it. And thus, they see it as a heresy, attack it, and try to eliminate it. Look at what happened to the pioneers such as Jesus Christ, Socrates, Copernicus, Galileo, and Luther in Europe. The degree of suffering they endured is a testament to what I am saying here. But everyone, consider my theory. I tell you that it is much more far off than those of the pioneers I just mentioned, and it is at least 1 or 2 centuries ahead of the contemporary time. 1 or 2 centuries ahead of contemporary time. This is an amazing gap. So you can imagine if the people of the time can only accept a new theory because it is so related to the culture of that time. When Meishu Sama came to tell us about the existence of God, acknowledging God, about pleasing God, living in a paradise on earth, how much he was not accepted by people of his time. Now, this was about 70 years ago. So it's still, Meishu Sama says, I'm 1 to 2 centuries ahead of my time. Just now, 70 years later, we're starting to grasp what Meishu Sama in reality was starting to share and trying to show us. And we still are having such a difficult time to grasp it. So what have we gathered so far from what we've read? Meishu Sama turned the church, instead of upside down, actually right side up, because his ultimate goal was to please God, not humans. He stressed that we needed to do the same. By becoming residents of heaven, we could please God. The increase of such individuals would transform this world. But this is a very radical way of thinking. And then in 1954, when Meishu Sama announced that Jorei was secondary, that Sonin was more important, where do you think Meishu Sama's mind was at that time? For sure, it wasn't aiming at that contemporary time because he was at least 1 to 2 centuries ahead of his time. So he was actually, you could say, in that point in time period, talking to us here today. What he was expecting from us, what he wanted us to learn and to put into practice. But how do we become residents of heaven? So Meishu Sama clearly stated we had to return to heaven. We had to become residents of heaven. And he clearly stated that we needed to live a way of life that pleased God, a truly God centered life. This is why we have the messages of Kyosho Sama. And the interesting thing is, uh, we've had many feelings, and I'm sure many of us have felt, oh, here we go again. We're studying Kyosho Sama's messages, and we're studying Masaki Sama's greetings. But in reality, the reason Meisho Sama created this position of Kyosho, the holy seat of Kyosho, was that he needed a physical body to work through in this physical world, to share his teachings, to put his teachings in current perspective so we could understand it. And Kyosho Sama, in his most recent message in February, shares just that. And I'd like to share that with you today. I know we've studied it before, but I'm just going to paraphrase, quote a couple of sections of this message. I'm not reading the whole message today. Kyosho Sama says, the reason why we were sent to this earth is this: for each one of us who receives a soul of God to return together with life and consciousness to heaven, the home of our souls, and be born again as the children of God. In other words, we were sent to this earth to be born anew as the children of God, as the Messiahs. God is trying to welcome each one of us into his heaven. Merge our consciousness with his. Make us inherit his consciousness and turn us into his children who can live eternally with him. Now, if we really take a look at this, it's the same exact thing Meisho Sama was saying, only in a more concrete way, explaining to us how to return to that heaven, how to become residents of that heaven. God is trying to welcome each one of us into his heaven. Meisho Sama says we need to return to that heaven. God is trying to welcome us into that heaven and merge our consciousness with his. Make us inherit his consciousness and turn us into his children who can live eternally with him, as Meisho Sama accomplished in 1954. Then Kyosho Sama says, in our hearts and minds, on the one hand, there are joyful and happy feelings. On the other hand, there are sorrowful and bitter and sad feelings. Likewise, there is a heart that wants to accept the name of Messiah and a heart that does not want to accept it. I believe God, through us, is uniting these conflicting feelings as one and is trying to share his true joy with all humanity without exception. Responding to this heart of God, we must return to heaven and surrender, in the name of Messiah, which is one with Meisho Sama, our conflicting feelings to God as one. So, understanding the human condition, understanding that there's a positive and a negative within us. There's a part of us that accepts God and accepts God truly alive and that I need to please God. There's also a part of me that wants to live my way, to do my thing, the way I think is best. Both of those feelings are actually one. They're the sides of the same coin. And we need to acknowledge that God wants to receive that in his heaven. And the name Messiah permits us to return to that heaven so that we can surrender that to God as we're being nurtured to live as God's children, as we're being nurtured to inherit God's consciousness. As God's light intensifies, what happens to us? What happens to our consciousness? As you increase light, in reality, everything that is hidden within us, our most deepest, darkest emotions, emotions that we've put away for thousands of years. I'm not talking about just this life. I'm talking from the beginning of creation. Feelings and thoughts that we have harbored and kept within us for such a long time start showing, start coming up. So we have feelings like certainty, we have feelings like courage, clarity, sureness, calm, excitement, and joy, and many others. But just as we have these positive feelings, they also have a negative side to them. So you have things like doubt, fear, confusion, insecurities, anxieties, indifference, and sadness. So, what Kiyosama is showing us is that we need to acknowledge both sides of our hearts, not just the positive side, not just the negative side. We need to acknowledge both. So, what makes us whole is both of these feelings that we have. And through the name Messiah, we are serving God. We are here to please God, to surrender that back to God, so that God can guide us to be born anew as His children. Now, why do I say this? Why am I bringing all this up today? Well, given that it's also part of the study session and its continuation from the previous weeks, many feelings are flourishing. For example, one was when Izonome Association, World Church of Messiah USA, we've decided to, during the live streaming, not channel physical Jorei. And this was a conscious decision to help each of us understand that in reality, we are all receiving Jorei from God 24/7. It is not the physical act of raising our hand that makes that happen. It is God within the center of our consciousness who is constantly channeling Jorei to us that we are just reminding ourselves of when we raise our hand. So when that decision was made to actually seek to truly follow what Meisho Sama was saying 70 years ago, naturally there was a reaction of confusion, of acceptance, of denial, of questioning. And it's okay for everybody to feel those feelings because God's light is shining. And God's light's shining so much that we feel all those feelings because God is showing humanity's heart through each one of us so that we can surrender everything back to God. So it is a natural process. And it is a natural process that we don't comprehend that all at once because in reality, Meisho himself said, my thoughts, my theory is 1 to 2 centuries ahead of its time. So when Meisho Sama started talking about really emphasizing the importance of Sone, when Meisho Sama started not raising his hand to channel Jorei, then all members, ministers at that time did not truly comprehend what Meisho Sama was doing. So it's normal that we ourselves can't foresee that far, 100, 200 years in front of the future. But we also need to acknowledge that Meisho Sama did that to please God. He was seeking to please God. And the question is, as he put for us, you also should do it this way. You should seek to please God. So, yes, it can be much more convenient for me to raise my hand and channel Jorei. It can be more convenient for me to raise my hand and say, let's just focus on this and let's not really talk about all those feelings that are in there if we don't raise our hand. Or we can truly seek to please God and seek to understand Meishu-sama's true desire. And as those feelings come up, which naturally they will because the light is getting stronger and stronger, it's impossible to hide them because it is impossible now to hide God's true wish, true will. We can surrender that back to God. And there's a simple way to do that. So nobody's saying we have to accept or not accept. We have to define. No, what we're actually saying is let's look at what's flourishing, what's coming forth from those feelings, both the positive and the negative. Let's acknowledge that God is using that to receive all humanity back in his heaven so we can become residents of paradise as God so wishes. And there's a simple practice for us to do that. Kira-sama left us and is always leaving us. Simple way that we can actually put this into practice. He says, one thing that we can say to God and express is, God, you allowed me to make your soul as if it were my soul, but it is actually yours. Forgive me, O God. In this way, following Meishu-sama, let us commit our souls into the hands of the Lord God. For thousands of years, we deviated ourselves from God. We turned our back to God and we put God in a far off place, even though he was alive and constantly present in our life daily. But God permitted us to do that so that today he can receive all of us back in his heaven to be born anew as his children. So all we need to do is acknowledge that this life, this soul, everything I'm feeling belongs to God. Ask for his forgiveness and surrender my soul back to God. Then Kira-sama also says, so let us serve in the work as a church that mediates, returns to heaven together with all of them, all our ancestors, all of creation, and say to God, O God, many have returned to your heaven now. If you so wish, please, could you welcome us as your children? This is very, very important. O God, many have returned to your heaven now. When we talk about surrendering to God, it's very easy, at least for me, to create an image where I'm here and I'm returning to some heaven far away from me. But in reality, when God shines his light, given the fact that God is alive within us and God only lives in heaven, we are also in heaven. And when God's shining his light through us, he's showing us all those souls, all those ancestors, all of creation that has returned to his heaven. And we, being an instrument of God, acknowledge that and surrender that back to God. We are just that vehicle, that channel to acknowledge that, representing all of humanity. In other words, to bow our heads before God, acknowledging that he is alive in the center of our consciousness. So there's no heaven that we're going to. Heaven is here. Many have returned to your heaven now. If you so wish, please, could you welcome us as your children? It's very important to use the name of Messiah. In the name of Messiah, which is one with Meishu-sama, many have returned to your heaven now. Please use us. Please, if you so wish, welcome us as your children. So, as these feelings are coming up, we don't need to judge each other because we agree or disagree, because we understand or don't understand, because we think it should be one way or another. That's not why we're here on this earth. We're not here to play God and say we know or we don't know. We're here to acknowledge that as those feelings are coming up, in reality, many have returned to God's heaven. And my role, my position in that is to surrender myself back to God with all those souls, to submit myself back to God. That is what's going to make God most happy. As Meish Sama did. Meish Sama, he says in the teaching that we read today, I want God to see me, not the people to see me. I believe that if it was Meish Sama's focus to have a church based on what he wanted and what he felt to please humans, he might have never changed the church name. He might have never talked about Jorei being secondary now. That Sonin was more important because it was comfortable. People were happy. But Meishu Sama himself in the teaching many times stressed, I have told you this several times already, we need to make God happy. Our goal, my goal, is to please God, and this should be your goal too. So everything that Meishu Sama did was truly God-centered life. So he was saying this is what it means to be God-centered, and what we are actually doing right now, if we're not doing this, is not God-centered. Because deep, 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 deep down inside somewheres, we are basing it on our point of view, on our ego. So this is a very, very difficult process. And it's not difficult because it's hard. I believe it's difficult because it's very inconvenient. It's inconvenient to accept that God is alive. It's inconvenient to accept that my way, how I think, how I see, is not really what God wants. And it's okay, because the reason we can see that it's inconvenient is because God's light's shining. So we know the right way, or else we wouldn't be able to have a contrasted feeling to it. We wouldn't be able to have a contrasted point of view. Just the same way that we know between happiness and sadness, there are differences. You can only recognize one because you know the other. So as God lights shine, it's like, let's say, God's light shines on happiness, but you see the shadow of sadness. And then what we end up doing is we end up focusing on the external, as Mesh Sama said so in the teaching today. We humans tend to look to the outside, to the external. And we see that reflection, we see that shadow. And we start focusing on the sadness, on the anger, on the problems. And we forget that God's light is shining also on the happiness, on the joy. So to really turn our minds and our hearts to God is a very difficult task, because we are so used to living a life that is not God-centered. And that's what we are being trained to do right now. So it's a simple task to recognize that God is alive. Someone said, even if we believe it or not, we have to recognize that God is alive. But when Mishama shared this, he was at least 100 years ahead of his time, if not 200, per his words. So imagine today. Meishu-sama is still 100 years ahead of his time as we are learning these teachings. And we can try with our limited human mind to comprehend that 100 years and try to catch up in reason, or we can choose to accept our role, which is to surrender everything back to God. We're being allowed to consciously participate in God's plan today, in God's plan of creation, serving, guiding all of humanity back into God's heaven, to be born anew as God's children. That's a lot of work in itself. We don't need to really try to comprehend 100 years ahead of now. It's like when Mishama gave the task to many reverends to pick up water from one jar and transport it to another jar with a sifter. It was actually it was like a straw hat kind of thing, straw uh, bowl, where if you pick up the water drips. And pretty much every reverend in there, except one, spent their time debating what Meishu Sama really intended by that task. Because it didn't make sense to them to pick up water from one jar that was full of holes, with a tray full of holes, to another jar. Meishu Sama couldn't possibly want them to do such an absurd task, to pick up water from here and put it here with a sifter. Let's say it's a sifter. And only one reverend at that time decided to pick up the jar as Meishu Sama had it stated and began transporting the water, even though it was dripping. So let's take a look in the context of that. These were Meishu Sama's reverends who were serving next to him every day, all the time. And only one reverend said, you know what, Meishu Sama is asking for this, let's do it. I don't understand it, but I'm going to try. And after a few times, Meishu Sama said, stop. And then he said to all of them, this is why I trust. In that case, it was Reverend Shibui. This is why I trust him. Look at the words Meishu Sama used. This is why I trust him. Because he picked up the water and started transporting, as Meishu Sama had requested. Everybody else was trying to, through reason, comprehend what Meishu Sama was actually saying, trying to decipher if there was some hidden meaning behind what Meishu Sama was saying. And here we can see very clearly in Meishu Sama's teachings that feeling that Meishu Sama was expressing to them and to us. You need to please God, not humans. If we learn to please God, naturally God's happiness will be shared upon humanity. Our focus is so external, it's so on humans all the time, that we are forgetting about God, even though we say we believe in God. This is Meishu Sama's words. Imagine the difficulty Meishu Sama had in 1954, in 1950, when he said all these changes were going to take place in the church, changes with Jorei, changes with the altar, changes with the sacred focal point. He said many changes are going to happen. Everything is going to be born anew. He says the importance of Messiah. This has to come forth to the world. Your job is to share it with the world, is what he said. Imagine his frustration when in 1954 he started to put many of these changes into effect and nobody followed. So nobody's obligating anybody to accept these changes. Meishu Sama didn't obligate anybody to accept anything. That has to be done out of our free will. But I would like to leave each one of us with the question: am I willing to put myself aside, my ego aside, and my thoughts and what I think and what I don't think, and seek to please God? Am I willing to truly follow what Meishu Sama was wishing for all of us to do? Meishu Sama came to show us how to live truly God-centered lives. He said so in his poems, and I was actually very surprised when I read it first. I've come to teach you to fear God, to obey and fear God. That discipline, that strictness that Meishu Sama had in respect to God, am I willing to learn to live in true harmony with God? Or not? It's a free will. Everybody has free choice, free will. And even if I don't understand it, and that's what I'd like to share with everybody today more than anything, even if I don't understand it, if I'm not 100% on board, that's okay. Because the objective is not to just accept and say, okay, I'm going to shut off my mind to the world. No, 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 no. God is receiving our consciousness back in heaven, as Kirsama says, as is. So, what I would like more than anything is for everybody to be able to seeing themselves as a second person, observe their feelings, and what we accept, what we don't accept, what we understand, what we don't, what we like, what we don't like. As a whole, we surrender that back to God. And we can be very honest with God. God, I do not understand this. God, from my personal point of view, I don't agree. So this feeling of not wanting to follow, this feeling of not understanding, this feeling where I think I understand, all of it, through the name Messiah, which is one with Meishu Sama, I would like to surrender it back to you with all of humanity and all of creation. May God's peace take place. May God's harmony take place. May God be happy. That's the true test of faith. Acknowledging that God is alive. Like Reverend Shibui did. He did not understand Meishu-sama's goal with that sifter. But even so, he picked up the tray and started transporting that water. And Meishu-sama trusted him for that. I believe God trusted Meishu-sama for that because Meishu-sama had that heart. And I think that's what Meishu-sama came to teach us. We're not going to always comprehend God's teachings. We're not going to comprehend God's way. That's impossible. It's God. We are like finite and tiny compared to God's infinity. But that God is alive within us. And that's important for us to remember. Meishu-sama, who was able to do that, is alive within us. So we say, oh, that's Meishu-sama. Meishu-sama was able to do that, but I can't do that. No, 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 no. That Meishu-sama, who was able to do that, is alive within us. That's the whole joy of this. It's so wonderful. We're not by ourselves. As we surrender all humanity, all our ancestors within us, back to God, Meishu-sama is there with us. Meishu-sama was able to do that. So let's entrust ourselves through the name Messiah that Meishu-sama taught us. And together, surrender all that back to God. That's what I like to share today. So let's work to really seek to live God-centered lives by acknowledging both the positive and the negative as a whole and surrender it back to God to be born anew as God's children. I think we have a few questions here. Let me check. One moment, please. So one of the questions that I see here, if I'm seeing correctly, is there a teaching written after 1954 in which Meishu-sama claims that light no longer radiates from the Jorei channeler's hand? Okay, so in 1954, it's very important to know, I think Meishu-sama, most of the teachings were dictated. Or basically, it was Meishu-sama's living experience. And as we studied last week, in the journals by Reverend Motokichi, which are the accounts of that interaction with Meishu-sama, he stated very clearly, Meishu-sama no longer raises his hand for Jorei. He does Jorei every day, but he does not raise his hand. He does it through Sone. So that was very clear. And then In that same year, right before Meish Sama made his transition in 1955, there is the example. He said, this one unique example I'm going to leave you is with the member who burnt herself while cooking. And Meish Sama told everybody to pray. When they went to request for Jorei, Meish Sama told them to pray. And it states that they prayed in their hearts. And I believe they went up to the altar also, but I'm not sure exactly. I have to get the quote. And the next day, she was healed. And Meish Sama said, this is the one unique example. So from now on, this is the example. So they went to ask for Jorei. And Meish Sama told them to pray to God. So I don't think that it's not that the light doesn't irradiate out. It's that the form in which Jorei and the form in which the divine plan would unveil changed. And Meish Sama says very clearly, in the age of night, the light irradiates out. So he uses the word tsuki to talk about the moon, which is tsuki in Japanese. And he says tsuku. Tsuku also means to point. So it goes from here to here. It irradiates out. That was in the age of night. Meish Sama says in the age of day, the light is the element fire. And that's he, which is fire, which is also sun. But he means fire. And he says the element of fire does not do like the earth, like the moon, where it goes from here to here. It actually goes from out inwards and returns to God. So God's light, as Kiyosama has been showing us, is shining within each and every one of us. That light is being irradiated. And now it's returning. All of it is returning back to God. So through our soning, through that surrendering, it's being returned to God. So Meish Sama made it very clear that we were already in the age of day, as we see in many poems, where he says the curtain of darkness open itself quietly. So he's showing that we were already in the age of day. The light of day returns to God. So you could say that it's not irradiating out, but it's irradiating back to God, to the center of our souls, to heaven. So I think that answers your question. It's actually two-part question. So in 1954, Meish Sama made it very clear that from now on, it was not the raising of hand in channeling Jorei anymore. He said it's different than before. He says it's Sone. And then he teaches the members to do that through that incident that took place. And he says this is the one unique example that you're going to have. So that was very clear teaching of Meish Sama in regards to that. And then in regards to the way the light works, irradiating out or in, that's the teachings of Meish Sama that we're all very aware of, where he talks about the age of night, it radiates out, and in the age of day, it returns back. And then I think there's another question here. One moment. So the other question here is, I think it would benefit all of us to know what challenges took place in the church between the deliverance of Meish Sama's message in 1950 regarding all the upcoming changes and his passing in 1955. So, like I just said, Meish Sama in 1950, in the inaugural statement, he declared that many changes were to come in the church. And he says the whole organizational structure of the church, the activities of the church, everything would change. On that date, he didn't declare what those changes would be. He just said there are many changes to come, prepare. And then in 1954, part of those changes started taking place when he drastically said, you know, I was born anew as a Messiah. And he says this is different than reincarnation. So up to that point, Meish Sama was teaching about reincarnation. In 1954, he said, I was born anew as a Messiah. So that was a very different, new way of looking and change. And then when he started talking about Soni and talking about Jorei, and that Jorei was secondary now, that Soni was more important, that we entered the world of Soni. So Meish Sama was showing that we entered this whole new era, this whole new world. in 1954 when he was born anew as a Messiah. He said, we entered the world of Sone. It's different than before. He said, he put it very clearly. But I think that upon his passing, that wasn't really looked into. And that's what we are now studying as Kirsama has been sharing with us, that heart and that sentiment of Meshama from 1954 to 1955, that huge transformation, because it was a huge transformation. Do we have any other questions? These are the questions I can see. Maybe there's some other questions. No, YouTube, nothing, right? Okay. Anybody on the phone would like to ask any questions? Some of the phones are muted. So if you're talking and I can't hear you, it means your phone is muted and I can't unmute it. So you guys need to unmute your own phone if that's the case.
Yep.
Bonnie? I can hear
He's
you
reading
now.
my mind. Well, it's the age-old question. And I'd be curious, I certainly have my thoughts, but I'd be curious to hear from you. How do we know we're doing God's will? I mean, sometimes one can get a feeling, I know that. Sometimes something, shall we say, just feels right. But how do we know?
That's a great question.
You know, it's a typical question, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yes, actually, I've been asked that a couple times. How do we know we're doing God's will? And then we have to ask ourselves, what is God's will? And Meishu Sama made it very clear. So from Meishu Sama's perspective, okay, Meishu Sama showed us through his life, his example, that our goal was to become residents of heaven, as we read today, right? And he shows that he was able to do that, and he shows that he was born anew as a Messiah, okay? So basically, Meishu Sama says that we, as followers of Meishu Sama in this movement, we have to guide basically humanity to return to heaven. So he gives the example of us climbing up the ladder. We return to heaven first, and then we extend our hands and pull everybody up, is the example he gives, right? So we have to become residents of heaven, like we read today, and then pull humanity to do that. So God's will is for us to be born anew as his children, as messiahs, like Meishu Sama was. So even Jesus, right, he says the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then he says, you can become my brother and sister. So you can become a Christ, basically, is what he was saying. And Meishu Sama says he came to this world to finish what Jesus started, to finish that prophecy, basically, the kingdom of heaven, to establish the kingdom of heaven, which was already here, and to teach us to become children of God. So that's God's will, right? To become children of God. How does God do that? And this is the very interesting thing that we've been learning with Kirsama's messages, as we've read today in a very small part. So it's not the whole message. I encourage you to read the whole message afterwards. I can send it to you. Kirsama says that God is receiving us and our consciousness as is back in heaven. So the ultimate creation of God is our consciousness, our individuality. And through us returning to heaven, which is in the center of our consciousness through the name Messiah, God is receiving that and giving us a new birth as a child of God, as a Messiah. So basically, God's will, to put it simply, is for us to, like Mish Sama said, bring all of humanity back to that heaven. So through our thoughts, through in a practical way, through our thoughts, through our feelings that we have in our daily life, it's creating your second self that's observing you all day. So let's say I create a second me that observes how Igor thinks and feels during the day. And through all those thoughts and feelings that I'm observing of myself, I invite all of humanity that has those thoughts and feelings to return to heaven with me and be born anew as God's children, surrendering my soul back to God. So that's what Mishama came to teach us how to do, how to serve God, how to truly, like you said, the age-old question, serve God's will, right? To be able to live God's will. So that's how we believe we can serve God's will. So it's not a hard task in the sense that it's your daily life. It's in the little things. It's not just a big thing. So it's in the little things. For example, let's say today you drank a cup of water and you had that feeling of relief. You know, it's a very hot day and you drink that cup of water and you feel that gratitude. That feeling, that opportunity to experience that through your individual consciousness is something that we need to return to God through the name Messiah, with all those connected to us. So, and then let's say you have a very bad experience. Okay, let's give a very not so nice experience, but let's say you got a nice parking ticket. Nobody likes parking tickets, and here we get a lot in New Jersey, right? So we go out there in the day and you realize that it was street cleaning and they gave you a parking ticket. That feeling that you get at that moment, that instant, in reality, that feeling exists for us to serve God's will. That thought that you felt at that moment exists to serve God's will. And everybody who ever felt that, everybody who had felt anything related to that experience, at that moment, God is inviting back to heaven through you surrendering them. So it's in the big things, but it's in the little things. It's in the simplest things. It's all the time. So it's to learn to actually live serving God in God's will 24/7. So it's a state of mind that we need to get to that rhythm. It's not something that we can do overnight. That's why it's a constant practice. So first we start off with maybe one or two feelings, one or two thoughts during the day. Then you can pick up and say, wow, today I spent half the day I was able to surrender pretty much everything I experienced. Until it gets to a point where you're in constant communion with God, surrendering all of that back to God, to the point that we can surrender our whole life, our whole consciousness back to God. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So God's will is pretty big, pretty general. It's to give birth to all of humanity. Right? Yeah. And then for us to be able to serve in that, it's through our whole actually life, through our experience of life as an individual self connected to all these beings. It's okay if you didn't understand, if you want me to rephrase it or say it's, you know, sometimes.
Could you say the last sentence you said just before? I didn't hear it.
So God's will, basically, it's to give birth to all of humanity, right?
Oh, okay.
And our way to serve in that is through our conscious experience of the individual self, through everything we're experiencing in our life, everything that we experience in our life through our five senses, our feelings, our thoughts, everything. We're serving as an individual consciousness that is connected to all of creation and surrendering all that back to God. So God can give birth to all humanity.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. That's a great question. Thank you for asking. Anybody else have any comments, any questions?
Oh, would it be doable? You talked about the teaching of Mesha Sama being very long, the one that you were referring to today.
Yes.
Is it doable to, shall we say, get a copy of that?
Sure.
Is there an English?
Yes, it's called The Birth of Our Religion, the one that I cut. It's called The Birth of Our Religion, and I can send it to you through email, and I'll post it in our Facebook page also for everybody to read it. It's a very good teaching.
Wonderful.
It's amazing. Mesh Sama's perspective of how he saw the world, and how really ahead of his time he was, and how hard it was for people to comprehend that. So even there's another teaching that he talks and he says, one day I'll probably win many Nobel Prizes, but right now even the Nobel laureates, they don't recognize what I'm talking about because it's too far ahead of its time. So it's not in that teaching, that part, but yeah, definitely I'd love to share that teaching. So I'll send it to you through email and I'll share it within the group for everybody.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Anybody else? Any comments? Any questions? Any feelings? I'd like everybody to know this is actually, it's supposed to be a very safe space for us to share. Nobody's judging anybody for any questions or anything like that. Like I said in the beginning of the study session, everything we feel, everything we experience in this study session is for us to surrender back to God. So like you said, Bonnie, right? How can we serve God? It's through this interaction, through these feelings, through these doubts. In the name of Messiah, we surrender all that back to God. And like I'll read something, you might get a different take on it, and that's okay. And that back and forth is what allows us to grow and be nurtured, to be born anew as God's children, as Messiahs. So I like to really express my gratitude because through these study sessions, I'm learning a lot with everybody, especially from the questions. So thank you very much for sharing and asking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I do feel safe.
It's wonderful.
And thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, and thank you for asking. So
I really feel safe, and it's wonderful, and I think because of your son and so on and so forth, and God's will allowing me to feel safe. Mm-hmm. And yes. I'm smiling.
Thank you for sharing. So what I'll do is we can close up the study session if there are no more comments for now. And if you guys have comments, questions during the week, we can do a question and answer next week, or we can actually go deeper into some more of this topic, which is it's very exciting. So let's remember that we're here to please God, right? And through pleasing God, humanity will receive true joy, God's joy, God's happiness, not what I think happiness and joy should be. That's why it's so important for us to put God first and please God. And the best way to do that is recognize that we are limited, that we don't have the perfect answer, and we don't have perfect feelings. We have all these different feelings, and they're opposite feelings and confusing feelings. And God wants that as a whole. He wants us to open our hearts to Him as is and surrender ourselves to Him through the name Messiah, because He wants us to really feel that true joy. So we're being very blessed because that joy is alive within us, and God wants to part it with us, but we have to surrender all of ourselves back to God and able to experience God's true joy. So thank you so much for letting me share that with you today, participating in the study session. I will share the teachings in the group, and I'll send by email for those who don't have Facebook. I'll send it out by email. Okay, thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. Tomorrow we're going to be studying again in Portuguese, and Minister Felipe is doing the prayers in the morning, which is also a great opportunity at 10 a.m. Eastern Time to participate and go deeper into these topics also. So make sure you tune in. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe to our channels so you can get the latest updates. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Blessings.
Thank you, Minister Eagle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.